All right, let's dive right in. We're tackling expressive therapies today, ET. You sent a bunch of interesting stuff our way on this one.
Yeah, tons of great material. And we'll be focusing mainly on this book, Using Expressive Arts to Work with the Mind, Body, and Emotions. Seems to cover a lot of ground.
Hmm.
Theory, practice, the whole shebang.
Exactly. The mission here, right, is to really get to the bottom of what ET is. How does it work? Where did this all come from? And how are these techniques actually applied? It's about finding those little aha moments that connect the dots between our minds, our bodies, and our emotions. That whole mind-body connection thing. So much going on under the surface.
Definitely. And it's not just intellectual either. It's about feeling those connections.
Totally. Okay, so something that really jumped out at me in the material was Helen's story, about her personal journey with ET. Sounds like it was really transformative for her, but she didn't exactly start out as a big fan of art.
Yeah, her story is super relatable, I think. I mean, at 11 years old, she had this experience where she felt like she failed at art, like she just wasn't good at it. And that feeling stuck with her. What's fascinating is how that early experience contrasts with how important expressive arts later became for her, both in her personal life and in her work.
It does make you think, how many of us have those kinds of experiences, like one bad experience, and it just shapes our whole view of something. It's almost like it closes a door.
For sure. And then sometimes, like with Helen, another door swings wide open.
Yeah. So she's dealing with all this emotional stuff, anxiety, feeling overly sensitive. She tries traditional talk therapy, but it's only giving her temporary relief.
It's like that earlier bad experience with art was kind of repeating itself. She wasn't finding the right way to express what was going on inside.
And the aha moment is talk therapy doesn't work for everybody, right? Like there's a whole other world out there for healing and processing emotions. And for Helen, that was experiential creative therapy. She describes it as a complete 180-degree turn, like she finally opened a window on a whole new sunny world.
That imagery really says it all, doesn't it? Especially considering how resistant she was to art in the beginning. It speaks volumes about the potential of ET, I think.
So it makes you wonder about where all of this came from, the origins of ET. Like, how did we get from talk therapy to expressing emotions through art, music, movement? Was Freud even onto something with catharsis?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we look at the bigger picture, ET has some roots in those early observations in Western psychotherapy. Freud, for example, saw some benefits in catharsis, that whole idea that releasing intense emotions could lead to a sense of relaxation and maybe even some resolution. That concept of emotional release, like really letting it all out, it pops up again and again in different forms throughout the history of psychotherapy.
It's interesting, right? Freud was seeing this idea of catharsis. But how did we get from just observing catharsis to actually using it therapeutically? And was this just a Western thing, or were there other cultures that had similar ideas?
You're totally on point. There's a whole rich history of healing rituals in various cultures that utilize cathartic release and practices that create altered states of awareness. These practices have existed for centuries. Take the Kung Bushmen and the Kalahari, for example. They have this amazing all-night fire dance. It's a ritual rooted in these really ancient sacred songs and rhythms passed down through generations of wise women. The idea is that through this intense rhythmic movement and singing, individuals and the community as a whole experience healing. It's about finding cohesion.
It's really fascinating that these ideas, they have roots in Western thought, but then you see these parallels in other cultures and their healing practices. The link between expression and healing, it seems to be kind of universal. So in the West, how did all of this evolve into, the more structured approach of ET we know today? How did those early observations become something people actually use to help others?
Right. So here in the West, things started to solidify as therapists began working with clients and really seeing how engaging them through creative means could be helpful. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach either. They were tailoring activities for different age groups, working with kids, adolescents, adults. This eventually developed into what we now call expressive therapies, generally used with clients from around 6 years old and up.
And what about the core principles? Like, what's the guiding philosophy behind all of this? What's at the heart of ET?
At its core, ET really emphasizes self-discovery, that inner journey, the exploration of our own internal world, the exploration of our emotional landscape. And this is done through creative processing. So the idea is that change comes from within the individual. It's not just about being told what to do or how to think. It's about facilitating this process of self-discovery. And that leads to change.
It's about owning your process, right? Taking responsibility for your own well-being.
Exactly. And it's empowering. It's about building resilience to deal with challenging emotions and difficult experiences. It's about developing those coping skills and strategies that come from a deeper understanding of ourselves.
So the material mentions some key figures who really influence the development of ET. It's a pretty impressive list of thinkers and practitioners, right?
It is. You've got the focus on the unconscious with Jung, exploring altered states of consciousness with Groff, the emphasis on the present experience with Pearls. It's really a tapestry of ideas and practices coming together.
A real convergence of different approaches. And it seems like the authors of this book, they've also added to the field, right? They've developed some practical tools and techniques that build on all of these core principles.
Absolutely. So building on the work of all these inspiring figures, they've created things like body focus exercises, symbol work, processes for emotional release, and self-discovery worksheets, all designed to help facilitate that intrapersonal processing, that self-discovery we were talking about.
So if we were to sum up the benefits for clients, it sounds like it's about more than just feeling better in the moment, right? Like there's a longer term goal.
Exactly. ET aims for a kind of dual benefit. It's about addressing those immediate therapeutic needs, helping people through whatever crisis or difficulty they're facing, but it's also about equipping them with the skills to regulate their emotions long term. You can think of it as developing emotional intelligence.
So building your emotional toolbox, right?
Yeah.
Giving people skills they can use for years to come, like recognizing and understanding their feelings, being able to bounce back from setbacks, managing difficult emotions in a healthy way.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And all of that contributes to this overall goal of helping people develop a greater sense of self-awareness, improving cognitive clarity, supporting them in problem solving, and finding safe and healthy ways to release difficult emotions.
It sounds like it's about getting unstuck.
Absolutely. And then learning how to stay unstuck. A lot of it comes down to creating new narratives, reframing those old stories that might be holding us back. And ET provides so many creative avenues for doing that.
Okay, so what about the therapeutic alliance? That relationship between the client and the therapist, that seems super important in any kind of therapy. How does ET approach that?
It's a very client-focused approach, really valuing the client's resilience and their innate capacity for self-discovery. A lot of emphasis on offering choices, engaging in what's called invitational relating, and just establishing that strong rapport and sense of trust. And it's also about being sensitive to the client's needs in terms of emotional proximity. Some people need a little more space, others need to feel a bit closer.
Like meeting the client where they're at emotionally.
Precisely. It's about creating that safe holding environment for the client. So much of it comes down to the quality of the therapeutic relationship. And the ultimate aim, of course, is to support positive changes in the client's emotional states, their behavior, their belief systems, their attitudes, all of that. And this, in turn, helps them to relate more effectively to themselves and to others.
So in a way, it's about creating a kind of microcosm of healthy relating within the therapy room, right?
Yeah, I like that. And the therapist really takes a back seat in terms of, not imposing their own ideas or interpretations. It's about going with the flow of the client's process, really being attuned to their preferred ways of learning and communicating. What are their strengths?
Yeah.
How do they best process information? And then, of course, paying close attention to their level of involvement. How engaged are they? Do they need more space? Less space? It's about constant attunement.
So the therapist isn't there to fix the client.
No, not at all. It's not about that. It's about facilitating, supporting, guiding. But the client is ultimately the one doing the heavy lifting. And by fostering this kind of therapeutic alliance, it empowers the client. It helps them to recognize their own agency and take responsibility for their well-being.
Now, emotion seems to play a pretty central role in ET. The material quotes Greenberg a lot on this, right?
He's a major figure in the field. And Greenberg really argues for the centrality of emotion in our functioning, just in how we move through the world,
Yeah.
but also in the process of therapeutic change. He believes that becoming fully aware of our emotions, like not pushing them away, is essential for being able to adapt and respond effectively to life's challenges. And he's got this idea about emotional schemes, these sort of underlying patterns of how we understand and relate to our emotions. And he says that these schemes need to be activated within the therapy process to really get to the deeper stuff, that intrapsychic information that might be driving our behavior.
It's like bringing those unconscious patterns into the light, right?
Yeah.
Making them conscious so they can be addressed.
Exactly. And ET provides so many creative and expressive avenues for doing that, whether it's through art, music, movement, writing, or even working with dreams. It's about finding a way to tap into that emotional world and make it more accessible to conscious awareness.
So it seems like ET takes a different view of the client than some other approaches that focus on pathology. It's not about seeing the person as inherently flawed, right?
Right. It's not about labeling or diagnosing. It's more about recognizing that, okay, maybe this person wasn't adequately prepared to take full responsibility for their well-being because of things that happened in their past,
Hmm.
difficult experiences, trauma, whatever it might be. They may be carrying a lot of emotional pain, and that can lead to all sorts of defense mechanisms that are really just attempts to cope.
Hmm.
So by using these expressive therapy activities, it allows the therapist to meet the client where they're at.
So it's less about fixing and more about understanding and supporting.
Precisely. And there are so many ways to do that. Sometimes it's about providing that quiet, non-judgmental presence. Other times it's about offering a creative outlet for expressing those difficult emotions that might be hard to put into words.
So the material mentions that there are these common factors that contribute to effective counseling, regardless of the approach. How does ET fit into that?
Well, there's a lot of research on what makes therapy work. And it seems like there are these four key factors that really account for positive outcomes.
Hmm.
One is client extra-therapeutic factors. That's just a fancy way of saying things that are going on in the client's life outside of therapy.
Hmm.
Do they have support systems? Are there positive things happening in their life? Then there are relationship factors. This is huge. It's about the quality of the relationship between the client and the therapist, that connection, that trust, that sense of being seen and heard. That's where ET really shines, I think, because it's so focused on creating that safe and supportive space, building rapport, and using those invitational relating techniques.
So it's not just about the techniques themselves, right? It's about the human connection that underpins the whole process.
Exactly. You can have the best techniques in the world, but if the relationship isn't there, it's not going to work. And then the other two factors, placebo and expectancy. Placebo is this fascinating phenomenon where just the belief that something will work can actually create positive change. And expectancy is about hope. Do they believe that change is possible? Do they have hope for the future? And again, I think ET really contributes to this because it offers so many creative ways to engage with the process, to experience some relief, to start to imagine new possibilities.
It's about reigniting that sense of hope, right? That things can get better.
Absolutely. And ET provides a lot of different pathways for doing that. Now, the material also talks about multiple intelligences, which
Yeah.
comes from Howard Gardner.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The idea that we all learn and express ourselves in different ways.
Exactly. And ET incorporates that, recognizing that clients come in with different strengths and preferences. Some people might be really visual, others might be more kinesthetic, some might learn best through music, others through language. And ET tries to address these diverse ways of knowing and being.
So it's about being flexible, right? Adapting the approach to fit the individual client. And there was also something about existential intelligence.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So Gardner has talked about the possibility of an existential intelligence, which relates to our human capacity to grapple with big questions,
Yeah.
the spiritual nature of existence, the meaning of life, all of that. It acknowledges this deep human longing to connect with something larger than ourselves. And by bringing in principles from transpersonal psychology, ET broadens the scope of how we relate to clients. It allows for a more holistic approach that acknowledges that spiritual dimension.
That makes sense. So we've talked about the why and the what of ET, but what about the how? How do these principles get put into practice? What are some of the specific methods and techniques used?
Well, there are lots of different ways to categorize the action methods used in ET. Some common categories include techniques for building that therapeutic connection, activities that promote self-awareness, methods for helping clients safely process emotions, approaches that utilize symbol and metaphor for transformative learning, activities that enhance self-esteem, and practices that support the integration of different aspects of the self. And then there's a big focus on developing emotional literacy and those essential inner life skills, or ILS.
It's quite a toolkit. Can you give us some specific examples of, say, how emotions are processed in ET?
Sure. So one of the key ideas here is about helping clients complete unprocessed and unexpressed emotional reactions. And they do this through various creative and expressive means. It's about externalizing those inner experiences, bringing them out into the open where they can be worked through and integrated. So you might see things like energy release games, where clients are encouraged to move and make sound, maybe even yell or shout. There are bioenergetic exercises that focus on body awareness and releasing tension. And then there's a lot of work done with guided imagery and visualization, creating dialogues with imagined figures, and using creative modalities like drawing, music, and symbols.
It sounds like it can get pretty intense.
It can, but always within the context of a safe and supportive environment. The therapist is there to guide and support the client through the process to make sure they don't feel overwhelmed or re-traumatized. And there's always an emphasis on integration afterwards. So it's not just about releasing emotions, it's about making sense of them, understanding them, and
Sure.
finding new ways to relate to them. It's about building those coping skills.
So what about those activities that aim to enhance self-esteem? How does ET approach that?
Those are often introduced both at the beginning and the end of the therapy process. At the start, it's about helping the client feel more positive about themselves and the process they're about to embark on. And at the end, it's about consolidating the work that's been done and sending them off with a more hopeful and empowered sense of self. So they might use things like guided visualizations, where the client is invited to imagine themselves embodying their positive qualities, or they might work with symbols that represent their strengths and achievements. They could also do role-playing to practice asserting themselves or setting boundaries, and a lot of emphasis on reconstructing their life narrative in a more positive light.
It's about rewriting the story, right?
Exactly, changing the narrative and recognizing that they have choices, that they're not just victims of their circumstances or their past.
You mentioned inner life skills and emotional literacy. Can you unpack those a bit more? Like, how does ET work on developing those?
So emotional literacy is about developing greater awareness and understanding of your own emotions. It's about being able to identify and name your feelings, to understand what triggers them, and to communicate them effectively. And ET uses a bunch of different tools to cultivate these skills. You might see self-discovery worksheets, where clients are invited to reflect on their emotional experiences. Or they might use body outlines to map where they feel different emotions in their body. Mandela artwork is another popular one. And then there's working with feeling word lists, exploring different textures, and using colors, lines, and shapes to express emotions. Music is also a powerful tool for exploring emotions. And the cool thing is, therapists are seeing that clients who engage with these tools often show a really quick improvement in their optimism and their confidence in dealing with their emotions.
So it's not just about understanding your emotions, it's about feeling more comfortable expressing them, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where those inner life skills come in. Those are the tools we need to manage our emotions effectively, to cope with stress, to build resilience. And ET provides lots of ways to practice and develop those skills.
It seems like ET is very focused on the body. It's not just about talking and thinking. There's a real emphasis on the physical experience of emotions.
Totally. And that's where those kinesthetic approaches come in. It's about recognizing that our bodies hold a lot of wisdom, and that sometimes the best way to access our emotions and work through them is to actually move our bodies.
To get out of our heads and into our bodies.
Right. So a big part of ET is about increasing clients' awareness of their body's messages. Like, what sensations are they feeling? Where in their body do they feel different emotions? And then it's about responding to those somatic symptoms, not just trying to get rid of them, but actually exploring what they might be trying to tell us. It's about learning to listen to our bodies.
And the material mentioned bioenergetics, which is a whole other world.
It is. And ET draws on some of the key principles of bioenergetics, particularly from the work of people like Lowen, Pirokos, and Reich. So you might see things like breathing exercises incorporated into sessions. Short breathing activities can help clients become more aware of their emotions. And then deeper breathing can be used to help loosen those psychological defenses that we all build up, allowing for a deeper exploration of unconscious material.
So it's about using the breath to kind of unlock things, right? To access deeper levels of awareness.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool. And it can be used in lots of different ways. It can be really calming and grounding. It can be energizing. It can even be used to help release trauma.
Now, there's a growing research base for ET, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's actual evidence that this stuff works.
Yeah, there's a lot of really promising research coming out. And the field also has a strong qualitative research tradition where they're really looking at the lived experiences of clients and therapists. And there's also tons of what's called practice-based evidence. Like, therapists have been using these methods for years and seeing positive results.
So it's not just anecdotal.
No, not at all. And the research is really starting to catch up. There are studies showing that ET can be effective in a wide range of settings, from schools to hospitals to private practice, and for a variety of issues, from anxiety and depression to trauma and relationship problems.
What are some examples of that research? What kinds of outcomes are they seeing?
Well, there are studies showing that sandplay therapy, which is a really popular ET modality, can be really helpful for kids in schools. It's been shown to improve reading comprehension and math abilities in children with learning difficulties, and it can also be really effective for kids with autism spectrum disorder.
So it's not just about emotional issues. It can actually help with cognitive functioning as well.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to how interconnected everything is, right? Our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, they all influence each other. So, by addressing the emotional piece, it can have a positive ripple effect on other areas of functioning. There's also research showing that expressive writing can be really powerful. There was this study where they used sentence starters with secondary students who had remedial writing needs. And just by giving them these prompts to help them get started, it significantly improved their writing skills and their emotional literacy.
It's like taking the pressure off, right? Giving them a framework to work within.
Exactly. And it can be really freeing. And the research is also showing that ET can be really helpful for adults too. There's a lot of research on the effectiveness of body-oriented therapies for things like PTSD and trauma. And there's also evidence that ET can help people with chronic pain, sleep disorders, even schizophrenia.
It's pretty remarkable. So it seems this resolving those unresolved negative emotions is a big part of what leads to healing in ET.
Definitely. When we're carrying around a lot of unprocessed emotional baggage, it can really weigh us down. It can affect our self-perception, our view of the world, our relationships, everything. But when we're able to process those emotions, to really work through them and integrate them, it's like a huge weight is lifted. We can start to see the world in a new light, more hopeful, more positive.
So it's not about just burying those emotions or pretending they don't exist. It's about actually facing them and working through them, which can be scary.
It can be, but it's also incredibly liberating.
Mhm.
And that's where the therapist comes in, right?
Right.
To provide that safe and supportive container for the client to do that work. And the beautiful thing about ET is that it provides so many different avenues for doing that work, whether it's through art, music, movement, writing, whatever resonates with the client.
You talked about invitational relating earlier. Can you say a bit more about what that looks like in practice?
Yeah. So it's about shifting from a more directive approach where the therapist is telling the client what to do to a more collaborative and client-centered approach. So instead of saying, draw your feelings, the therapist might say, would you like to explore how you're feeling through drawing? Or maybe we could try some movement. It's about giving the client choices and honoring their autonomy. And this can be really powerful because it helps the client feel more in control of the process, which can deepen their engagement and their trust in the therapeutic
So
relationship.
it's about empowerment, right?
Totally. It's about respecting the client's pace, their preferences, their needs, and even these seemingly small moments of decision-making. They can be really significant. It can help the client develop a greater sense of agency, which can then translate to other areas of their life.
It makes sense. So how does ET approach the physical aspects of emotional blockage? Because it's not all in our heads, right?
No, definitely not. Our bodies hold a lot of this stuff.
Mhm.
And so ET draws on the work of Reich, who talked about muscular armoring, which is basically this idea that we hold tension in our bodies as a way to protect ourselves from difficult emotions. And even Freud noticed that after a distressing experience is released and integrated, the body tends to relax. It's like we're literally holding on to this stuff.
Like we're bracing ourselves for impact.
Exactly. So in ET, they pay attention to the somatic signs of emotional arousal. Like, where is the client holding tension? What are their physical sensations? And then they might use gentle body-focused techniques to help release that tension. And this can sometimes lead to a process of ventilation or catharsis, where there's a big release of emotion, sometimes even physical release, like shaking or crying. And this can be really powerful because it allows the client to fully experience and process those emotions that they've been holding on to. And when those emotions are released, it can create a lot of space for healing and change.
And the material talks about how ET draws on some neurobiological principles as well, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of fascinating research on the brain and how it changes in response to experience. And one of the key takeaways is that the brain is constantly rewiring itself based on what we do, what we think, and what we feel. So the goal in therapy, from a neurobiological perspective, is to create the conditions that allow for new neural pathways to be formed, which can then lead to lasting change.
It's about creating new possibilities.
Exactly. And one of the key things that neuroscience is showing us is that the brain is most plastic, meaning most open to change, when we feel safe and connected. So that's a big focus in ET. It's about creating that safe and supportive environment for the client. And it's also about building that strong therapeutic alliance because that sense of connection and trust can actually help to rewire the brain. It's pretty amazing.
So it's like the therapy itself becomes a kind of a corrective emotional experience.
It can be. And there's also this really interesting connection between attachment and emotional regulation. So the part of the brain that's involved in regulating our emotions, it's also the part of the brain that's responsible for attachment. And that develops in early childhood based on our relationships with our caregivers. So if we didn't have secure attachments in childhood, it can make it harder for us to regulate our emotions as adults.
It's like we never learned how to do it effectively.
Right. And so ETs recognizes this.
Hmm.
And it provides a lot of support for helping clients work through those early attachment issues and develop those emotional regulation skills. Because when we can regulate our emotions, it impacts everything: our relationships, our work, our sense of self.
It's foundational. And it's interesting to consider how those early experiences can shape our whole way of relating to the world.
Absolutely. A lot of adults, they're uncomfortable with big emotions, so they try to control them, suppress them, or even ignore them in their children. And so many people grow up learning that certain emotions are not okay to express. And they develop these coping mechanisms, which can be helpful in the short term, but they can also become these patterns that are really limiting and keep us stuck.
It's like we're carrying around these old scripts that are no longer serving us.
Exactly. And until we become aware of those scripts and start to challenge them, they can continue to run the show. And they can really impact our relationships, our work, our overall well-being.
So the breath comes up a lot in ET. It seems like it's seen as more than just something we do to stay alive.
Right. It's seen as this bridge between our bodies and our minds. And there's a lot of awareness in ET of how our breathing patterns can be affected by stress, by trauma, by unresolved emotions. So they might use breathing exercises to help clients regulate their nervous system, to calm down when they're feeling anxious, or even to access deeper levels of awareness.
It's like the breath can be this doorway into our inner world.
It can. And there are so many different ways to work with the breath. It's a really versatile tool, and it's something that clients can take with them and use in their everyday lives.
Now, catharsis is another concept that's mentioned in the material, and it seems like ET takes a nuanced view of it.
Yeah, there's been some debate about the role of catharsis in therapy. Some people believe that it's really important to have these big emotional releases, while others are more cautious about it. And ET kind of falls somewhere in the middle. They recognize that catharsis can be helpful, but it needs to be done in a safe and controlled environment. And it's not something that they would typically do in the early stages of therapy.
So it's not about just letting it all hang out.
No, it's about creating a container for those emotions to be released in a way that feels safe and manageable for the client. And it's also about integrating those emotions afterwards. Because catharsis on its own isn't enough. It's about making sense of those emotions, understanding them, and finding new ways to relate to them.
So it's about finding that balance between expression and integration.
Exactly.
Now, the idea of utilizing multiple intelligences in therapy sounds really interesting. It's like recognizing that we all learn and express ourselves differently.
Yeah. So one of the things that ET therapists do is they try to identify the client's dominant intelligences. Like,
Hmm.
are they more visual, more auditory, more kinesthetic? And then they tailor the therapy to fit the client's strengths and preferences. So, for example, if a client is really visual, they might use a lot of art and imagery in the therapy. Or if they're more kinesthetic, they might do more movement-based exercises.
It's about meeting the client where they're at.
Exactly. And it can make the therapy so much more engaging and effective when you're working with the client's natural strengths. And it also helps to create a sense of competence and mastery, which can be really empowering for clients.
It sounds like the training for expressive therapists is pretty intense. There's a lot of emphasis on personal development, right?
Absolutely. It's seen as essential that therapists do their own work. That they explore their own emotional landscape, their own triggers, their own blind spots. Because if they haven't done their own work, it can really impact their ability to be present and effective with clients.
It's about walking the walk,
Yeah.
right?
And so a lot of the training involves experiential activities. Like they'll do a lot of the same kinds of exercises that they'll be doing with clients. They will explore their own attachment styles, their family of origin dynamics, their own experiences with trauma and loss. And this helps them to develop greater self-awareness, empathy, and compassion, which are all essential qualities for any therapist, but especially for ET therapists.
Because they're holding space for clients to go to some really deep places.
Exactly. And it's important for them to have the skills and the experience to be able to hold that space effectively and to be able to recognize when they need to refer a client out if it's beyond their scope of practice.
It sounds like ET is very much about empowering the client.
It is. It's about recognizing that the client has the inner wisdom and resources to heal. And the therapist is there to help them access those resources. And so there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration, on shared decision-making, and on really honoring the client's autonomy.
It's about partnership, not hierarchy.
Exactly.
Now, attachment theory seems to be a big influence in ET.
It is. And
Hmm.
one of the key takeaways from attachment theory is that our early relationships with our caregivers have a profound impact on our development,
Oh.
on how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, how we cope with stress, everything. And so ET recognizes that a lot of the issues that people come to therapy for are rooted in those early attachment experiences.
It's like those early experiences create a blueprint for how we relate to the world.
Right. And so part of the work in ET is about helping clients understand those blueprints, those patterns that they might be unconsciously repeating. And then it's about helping them develop new, healthier ways of relating. And it's not just about romantic relationships either. It's about all of our relationships, our
Yeah.
friendships, our family relationships, our work relationships.
It sounds like a lot of it is about becoming aware of these unconscious patterns
Right.
and then finding ways to interrupt them.
Exactly. And ET provides so many creative ways to do that. Like you might use art to express those early attachment wounds, or you might use movement to explore different ways of being in a relationship, or you might use writing to reauthor your story.
So it's about bringing those unconscious patterns into the light of consciousness so they can be transformed.
Exactly.
It's fascinating. So the
Yeah.
material talks about this unconscious drive to kind of reenact those early relationship patterns. Can you say more about that?